they come out on four, the green flag waves.
Hey, welcome back to Race Scene. Well, we're in the shop now with Carl Bush, Wilwood Disc Brakes. Great to have you here, Carl.
Thank you, Roger. It's great to be here.
Well, you know, we've done some other shows on brakes, and now we're going to move it on out to the corners of the car a little bit more, out to the rotor, where the work's actually being done.
Yeah, the brake rotors can be a critical selection for a racer depending on the type of race car that you're having. Because the rotor has to do two jobs. First of all, it has to be able to make leverage with the caliper to slow that wheel down. And that leverage is oftentimes determined by the diameter of that rotor. The larger rotor diameters give that caliper more leverage to slow that wheel down. Smaller rotor diameters have less leverage. But the key factor to what the rotor really has to do is you have to think of the rotor as being the radiator for the brake system. It has to be able to absorb and dissipate all the heat that's being made between the interface between the brake pad and the rotor so that it can effectively manage that heat and keep that from going, the system from going into meltdown.
Right.
Now, rotors for a lot of applications are made from a lot of different materials, but most commonly on a asphalt late model, on a dirt late model, modifieds, short track racing across the country, we're typically looking at vented cast iron rotors. Now, cast iron has excellent properties as far as thermal expansion and heat conductivity, so that's one of the reasons why most of the rotors, even the ones that you drive on the street, are made from cast iron. There are a lot of different shapes and sizes and designs. Now, when we talk about a vented rotor, we're not talking about a rotor that's been drilled with holes or face slotted. We're talking about a rotor that has two different pad contact surfaces with the surface cooling vanes in between and the ability for air to flow between the rotor contact faces. Thus the reason, the term for venting. Now, within those different styles of venting, we may have straight vane rotors. As you can see here, these vanes run straight through the rotor. Now, when we get up into the next level of heat management ability, we're going to be looking at a directional vane rotor. Now, you can see that this has the same number of vanes, but these rotors are cast in on an angle. It's a little easier to see that illustrated here on this rotor cutaway, the way that the vanes are cast in. Now, with the straight vane rotor, it doesn't matter which side of the car that those are run on, but with the directional vane, it's important that the rotor be turning in the direction that the air be coming through from the inside out. These longer vanes give that rotor more cooling surface area, so it helps to be able to do a better job to help to dissipate that heat that's being absorbed in while you're on the brake pedal.
And in heat dissipation, surface area is king.
Surface area and then the overall weight of the rotor has a lot to do with just how much heat that rotor can absorb and dissipate. When we go from a rotor like this, Dalton, every racer loves those lightweight parts. They accelerate quick, keep the rotating down, keep the unsprung down, and help with the handling, but there can be some trade-offs to running too light of a part.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you can get down that straightaway in a hurry, but it isn't going to do you any good if you can't stop it at the end.
That's right. If the rotor isn't heavy enough to manage that heat, the system's going to overheat, you're going to go into meltdown, you could fade the pads, you could boil the fluid. It's going to give you the inability to finish because the system overheated.
And I guess probably the best way to diagnose it is with temp paint if you're having brake issues.
There's a lot of ways to determine whether or not you're running in a manageable temperature range. Performance off the racetrack is one way. Using heat paints to change colors when it gets to a certain temperature, but sometimes just looking at the rotor to see if it looks like it's turned blue or turned colors, it's easy to see if something looks overheated and burnt. So that's when we go back to if you are having problems, if the system's getting too hot, if you're fading pads, then you decide, one, do I need to go to a heavier rotor? Do I need to go from a straight vane 32 vane? Do I need to step up to a 32 vane directional vane? Or even on up to something like this that's a 48 vane directional rotor. Keeping in mind that sometimes the easiest comparison is just how much do these rotors really weigh? We go somewhere from a 5.5 pound rotor on up to a 12.5 pound rotor, with the rotors in the middle somewhere in the vicinity of 9 pounds. The heavier the rotor, the longer it's going to take to heat up, the better job it's going to be able to do and be able to absorb and manage and dissipate that heat that you're making during the race.
Couldn't you also just move wider in diameter to give your brake pads a little bit more leverage on the rotor itself.
Going to a bigger diameter is going to do two things for you. One, it's going to give the caliper more leverage to stop that wheel, but yes, by going to a bigger diameter rotor, the rotor is going to have more surface area and it's probably going to be heavier, so it's going back up on surface area, back up on overall mass or weight, so that it can do a better job of managing that heat for you.
Well, we got to go to commercial break, but we'll be back with more on brake pads and how they work with brake rotors.
Okay, Carl, well now, we've talked about the rotors. Now let's talk about the proper pad selection. There's a lot of choices here.
Yeah, brake pad selection can be a real critical aspect of making sure you have the right setup on your car to go to the track. Now, I'd be willing to bet that most of you racers who are watching us today know exactly what tire compound you had on the car the last time you raced. So I'd be willing to bet that that percentage is going to drop to about half when I ask you, what brake pad compound did you have on the last time you raced? Brake pad compound can be a very critical selection, just as tire compound can be. Characteristics of a brake pad compound that you want to consider: first of all, the brake pad has to be matched up to the temperature range that the car is going to see during the race. It also has to have enough of friction to properly stop the car and give the driver the response he's looking for. And then it also has to have a long enough wear rate so that there's still pad left on the backing plate before the end of the race is over. When you look at pad compound selection, if you look at the dyno graphs for a brake pad test, you're going to see that it looks very similar to an engine dyno test. But instead of seeing graph lines to where you're going to have engine RPM and torque values, you're going to see temperature range and friction values. Just like an engine is going to have a peak effective temperature range for where it makes the best torque through its RPM range, a pad compound is going to have a temperature range to where it's most efficient. And Dalton, you can probably feel this sometimes in the car when you first go out for practices or warm-ups or qualifying, that the brake response just isn't quite the same
as if it were in a race. After a couple corners, you can definitely feel them brakes starting to come in and be a lot more responsive when you first step on that brake.
Yeah, and that has to do with the illustration on that dyno graph. As you can see, in those colder temperatures where the friction value is low, but then as the pad builds heat, then it comes up to its efficient temperature range. And once again, we got to have that efficient temperature range matched up to what the car is going to see during the course of the race.
And there could be some differences here. There's enough temperature difference from track to track that might warrant using different pad compounds at different tracks.
Yeah, not only using different pad compounds from track to track, but sometimes, as we talked a little earlier about, early on in a race, say for a qualifying session, if you get to a place to where you're racing on a track where it's a high momentum track, you're not on the brakes very long, you're never going to build very much heat into the brakes, you need a pad with good low temperature response that's going to make the driver comfortable on those momentum laps, or maybe on those first laps of qualifying, or on those first laps after a yellow flag. But when you get out to running sustained laps, lap after lap, if you're on a track with hard braking corners and short straightaways where you don't have a lot of time for a cool down, you need a pad that's going to have its responsive range in that higher temperature range.
Right, and something just too, if you're under a long caution, probably wouldn't hurt to keep some heat in those brakes too, would it?
Now, keeping your brakes up to temperature is very important. Very few drivers are going to roll their car out onto the track without warming the engine up, warming the rear end gear oil up, and making sure that things have temperature in them. Same applies to your brake system. Cast iron especially, they don't like abrupt changes in temperature. So if you go out on a track with an ice cold rotor, and you run it down into the first corner and put a lot of heat in it, sometimes that's where your first cracking will take place on the rotor. So parade laps, caution laps, anytime when you're getting ready to go to green flag, it's good practice to be going on and off the brake pedal, put some heat in, give it a rest, put some heat in and give it a rest, and gradually bring those rotors and pads up to temperature so you don't have to wait so long for the system to get responsive. Plus, without shocking them with quick changes to temperature, you get better life out of your pads and rotors.
Now, what do you think about mismatching compounds of the brake pads themselves to make some more front braking than the rear, like in a Pro Stock or Super Stock?
Well, that can be very important when you get into categories to where you might not be able to split up master cylinder sizes or split up caliper sizes and have those other adjustments to put bias in favor of the front or rear brake depending on what kind of racing you're using. Using pads with different compound, with different friction values from front to rear can help you put that bias into the car that you might need to give you the handling characteristics that you need when that car's up to temperature and running fast laps.
And that's one point too, where it would be critical to keep heat in those brakes under caution laps because they do have different friction rates at the different temperatures, right?
Yes. Ideally, you want to keep your pads and rotors at a consistent temperature as much as you can during the race. That keeps your system response as consistent as possible from beginning to end.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. We got to run out now. See you next week.